Welcome to the Product Shipping Forecast, where we help you navigate the treacherous waters of product development. I'm Rosie, a product engineer at Zero Heights, and I'm joined by my co-host and product design colleague, Rob.
Hey.
Just realised producer Cat will tell us off because we've already used the phrase at Zero Heights, which we've just been told we use far too often. But there we go. What a way to start. So today's topic, we're going to jump into research. So on our first two episodes, we covered off developer handoff and QA, which are more at the end of building products in the right way. And we've kind of missed a big step in how do we actually know that what we're building is even the right thing. So most people would say that the key to a great product is user research, but it's a topic that is quite often misunderstood and sometimes just sort of completely ignored. So Rob, sell it to me. Why is it important for us to do research before we start working on a new product area?
I think the number one reason is what you said at the start there, which is making sure you're actually building the right thing in the first place. I think it's really easy to kind of get wrapped up in great ideas that you might have as a designer or a developer or a product person and think, just steamroll ahead. But actually, if you're not kind of going back to users and kind of understanding like what it is they're looking for and what challenges they're facing, you might be sending yourself down a complete dead end. I think you can definitely see that over history where people have tried things that look very neat from a design standpoint and then kind of don't really work in practice. Things that have, where resources have been put into kind of the wrong features or functionality. And so I think it is really about kind of more understanding. But I think also, even if you've got a clear idea of what it is that you're trying to build, always trying to learn more and trying to understand more, I think it's just something we should always be doing. We are just a few people in a team, and our viewpoints are always going to be quite limited. And the more perspectives you can get into that process and the more like insights you can glean, I think the better your work is always going to be.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's quite a common thing, I think, especially as an engineer, to jump straight to solutions. Sort of hear like, the problem is X. And it's like, well, the solution must be Y because that's the one I want. And I think especially if your audience doesn't match you at all, it's very key that you actually get their insights. And I think even when the audience does match you, sort of like, even if I'm working on features that are for developers, I've got to realize that I'm only one type of developer. There are loads of different styles out there and also generally just different opinions. And some of it's also like, we know the product we're working on so well that you can make bold assumptions that it's just super obvious. And then you suddenly realize that to other people, it's a complete mystery.
Yeah, that idea that you are not your user is something that I think a lot of research advocates will kind of preach. I think it's particularly for folks working in. Okay, my connection.
Welcome back. Yeah, nice drop out there. You're back. You're telling us about some sort of key important phrase.
So you are not your user is something that a lot of research advocates will often kind of push. And I think, it makes a lot of sense when you're in B2B because, if you're designing like admin software for HR teams, a product designer is not working in a HR team. But I think with like B2C, like that can often be very tricky. If in the past I've worked on finance apps, and it was always very important to kind of remember that like even though I'm a designer and I don't fully understand how money works, I probably understand money slightly better than most of our customers because I can just turn around to the person who designs our credit card and go, hey, how does a credit card work? And get like way more insight. And so I think that kind of thing of always being able to take a step back and realize that, you are not the most knowledgeable and that actually maybe you have prior knowledge that influences how you see something is kind of really important to kind of be aware of and always being like questioning of whenever you're kind of designing or building something.
Yeah, definitely. It all sounds super obvious, is what I would say from this. And I think that leads me more to the question of why does it then always get overlooked that actually it's so important to do research and include it as part of the product development process?
I guess a lot of it comes down to cost, right? Like research is seen as both like monetary and time expensive. There's like, if you want to build up a really great research team, then you need to be hiring researchers, and researchers don't necessarily like output like designs that engineers can build. Like they're a step before that. So first off, you've got a lot of like research roles that just get wrapped up into the kind of like the UX skill set. But then also there's the cost of like recruiting participants. There's also the time of like actually, finding the right people, prepping interviews, running those interviews, or any other research. User research is not just like user interviews and usability testing. There's like desk research, there's competitive analysis. And so I think a lot of that stuff just kind of falls by the wayside. The other thing as well is just, I think a lot of it ends up getting pushed into like other like departments. So you might see some of this stuff getting done by marketing teams, or product people doing a lot more of the kind of like discovery led research, and some of that stuff often ends up with a very specific skew. Marketing stuff will look much more at how you kind of sell something rather than necessarily like what are the kind of core problems that you might want to then go off and solve. It's more, let's go for that. And same with like product. I think, I work with some product people who are great researchers, and I've worked with some who are really not. And,
not naming names.
Not naming names. But I think that's just because, like the kind of world they come from does research and does sort of understanding needs in a very different way. It's very business oriented, whereas I think a lot of like UX folk come from a background that's much more about kind of listening and sort of uncovering like needs and pains in a very different way.
Yeah, I think that's all completely fair. I think especially the point around it being expensive, it's one of the things I've sort of personally not ever thought was bad, but when it comes to sort of like engineer involvement, for example, it's always been like, oh, is it like a good use of engineering time? And I think we'll come onto this a bit later on, but yeah, I think that sort of like personnel expense can become a bit of a topic, and people sort of like, oh, is it worth spending the time on when we could just send out a Google form to a handful of people and hope for the best and take it from there, which I think leads you much more down you have a solution in your mind and you're sort of asking questions around it. You're like, would you find this useful? Which isn't really research. It's more like validating whether or not an idea that you have is actually helpful.
I think there's a psychological thing as well, right? Which is a lot of people just don't want to admit that they don't know something. And doing good research, very open about the fact that like you don't know something. And so that I think puts people in a bit of an awkward position. I think particularly, startups, often start with like a really great core idea that someone has spotted an opportunity and they've kind of met that and they're starting to like build out a product. And then to go into that state of, okay, we solved this one specific problem, we don't know what the other problems are, is a really tricky one, because you kind of feel like you've been given that kind of like validation of like, oh, we know what we're doing, we're now the experts, we're pushing things forward. And actually I think particularly for even I think some UX folks, it's hard to take that step back and say, I don't know something, I need to go and learn more, because that's often seen as a bad thing in business, to kind of have this idea that you are maybe ignorant about something.
Yeah, definitely. I think there's the idea that you just need to know everything and know exactly where your product's going and exactly what thing would be helpful next. And I think there's some sense of intuition. I think the longer you work on a product, like you will have a slightly better intuition as like what could be right. But yeah, it's definitely easy to sort of be blind to some of the more rogue ideas that could take something in a completely different direction. You sort of like touched on it a little bit, mentioning like startups and stuff, but is there anything more specific that you should be aware of with research when it comes to sort of like a B2C organization versus a B2B one? Like, I've sort of worked at both and seen how products can be developed so differently. So I guess that also probably means that you need to actually go about the research in a completely different way as well.
Yeah, I think there are definitely likewise I've worked at both. Worked B2C, like working on kind of like sort of consumer finance, savings accounts and things like that, which the great thing with like B2C is often you can just go out to like the general public. There are a lot of like really great kind of research recruitment agencies that will kind of like, for kind of like a per participant fee, just help you find people. And that's really cool because that kind of offloads a lot of the work of like, we need to get people in, we need to pay out incentives, making sure that we've got kind of NDAs and stuff set up and ready. And you then just need to plan the actual script and run the research itself. I've used that at previous companies and it's just been great. Like we had a way of just getting like 5 or so people in every week. And we always had stuff to show them, whether it was discovery, whether it was usability testing. And they were kind of always, we got a bit of a demographic profile for everyone of like, what kind of person they were, employment status, all that kind of stuff. And that's great if you're working on like, say, a banking app that like you're hoping anyone in the UK will be able to, sign up for. Most people, people's financial literacy differs, but ultimately everyone has kind of interacted with banking in some way and so can have some input. It's very different if you're working for a B2B organization and your product is about helping visual effects artists like track the work they're doing. And so you're creating a product that has a lot of jargon, is maybe very data intense. That suddenly becomes a lot harder to just recruit, Joe Public and say, hey, does this make sense? Like there are some things you can do, right? You can still put something in front of someone and kind of understand how they view and like process information, but you're not going to be able to understand like, okay, now imagine you had to work on a visual effects shot that requires you to kind of rig a character model and then pass it off to the lighting department. Like you're already starting to get into a bunch of things that like the regular person is not going to know about, and that is going to just not be that useful. And so in those cases, like it just becomes much harder to recruit, and often you kind of have to start thinking. That's what we've kind of done is like work directly with customer facing teams, right? Your support team, customer success team, working and trying to see people go to industry events, what kind of conferences, what kind of meetup. One, going there to listen in and learn, because you'll learn about the industry in that way, in terms of like what are the trends and stuff people are talking about, but using it as a networking opportunity to just kind of like get in touch with people who are in that field that you can then be like, hey, we spoke at this thing. Would you be interested in, this product a little bit more? Like leave off the sales pitch, but that is obviously like a lot harder. And if you're very introverted, it's going to be quite tough. But hopefully, there are people in your company that also have those connections as well. Typically, every B2B I've worked at, like there have been some people in the team, whether that's on the support team, whether that's in like key departments who have come from the industry. Most of our like success people, most like a few of our engineers came from the world of VFX, so they had connections into those studios and things like that. So
nice.
either differences.
Yeah. Would you say, you sort of like briefly touched on it, but would you say that actually getting feedback from sort of like customer success managers and like other people in the company that are talking directly to customers still counts as user research, or does it also feel like it has quite a strong bias to you? Because I've sat in both camps around being like, oh, this is great, this is amazing. Like, there's all this information. And I've also sort of been on the side where sometimes I'm like, I'm not sure how strongly to take some of it, because sometimes there's a case of, obviously, if there's been a suggested solution sort of like floating around in the company, and then a customer success manager takes it to a company and sort of like throws it out there, and that company just bites at it and goes, yes, sounds perfect, without actually maybe trying to properly understand what the problem is. And so I don't know if it can you end up chasing the wrong idea. So yeah, I just wondered if you had any more thoughts on that sort of side of things.
Yeah, I think with everything, it's a question of like, how many people you're hearing it from. Like the biggest risk whenever you like do user research is you're often working with like relatively small numbers, unless you're going for like surveys, right? And you can do it at scale. A lot of full of people, standard kind of like run at a bit of research. So I think you always kind of have to.
I think you fully cut out now, Rob. So when you come back, you might need to recap the past few minutes. You're back. Oh no, you're gone again.
Okay.
And now you're back. From the top with my wonderful question about customer success managers. What was your answer?
Yes. So I think as with anything, it's about understanding, like, research, particularly qualitative research. You are taking a very small sample size, and it's more about looking at trends. If someone is coming to you with like a solution, I always kind of push back with like, it's more important to understand like the rationale behind that. The thing that I've tried to do in the past is encourage people to talk about like capabilities. So like, what capability does this unlock for your team if you are able to have X feature? And that often then like helps to reframe it in terms of like, oh, well, this is the problem we're facing, which then can lead you down that path of, looking at more interesting solutions. But I definitely say, like, unless you're talking to people directly, it can be quite difficult to just receive stuff secondhand and treat that as valid research. With kind of like more of the CSM and kind of support side of things, I'm always interested more in like the scale. So like in previous companies, in fact, I think at the finance company I was at, because we had a customer support team, they would log and track kind of all of the queries they were getting. So, things like, how do I get a new credit card? How do I, top up my savings account? All those kind of things. And like, I mean, those weren't the most common things, but like examples I could remember. But they would track those as like, okay, here's a common thing that people are asking for, put together a little dashboard that sort of showed like, here are the common things we're seeing. And then the product teams could actually use that as an initial data point to say, okay, like, here's the things we're hearing, here's the things people are calling up about, how can we make this easier? And it, like, that was like a really nice way of like adding improvements into the product, was just simply like, how do we make it so that our support team has to deal with less of this issue, which could just be solvable in app. I think also, one thing that we have done a little bit, both at previous companies and at Zero Height, is, sharing stuff with CSMs to then share and kind of get initial feedback, or even just getting product people or designers to sit on a call and just get like 5 minutes. It's not ideal, but I will say, like, as long as you're like finding 5 minutes to talk to a customer, like, that's great, valuable research, and is like at least a step towards being able to like do more in-depth stuff. Because half of the battle is often just proving that you can get value out of this.
Yeah, no, I think one of the things we've done that I've found is like a nice like middle ground when, so obviously at the moment we don't have like a full UX researcher, so we're just kind of like winging it. But actually like adding in places, like adding in feedback links to new features, and it being quite like a simple form of like, how is this working? And then kind of like leaving like an open text field of like, do you have any thoughts and feedback? And obviously like then having a way to then contact the person back. So if someone's like given some really cool, interesting ideas about what they think's missing from the feature, actually then having a way to reach out to them to be like, why? Like, what is it that's solving? As you said, like, I really liked the idea of asking them if they like a solution of what it would solve for them, to then try and reframe what they're actually wanting from it. Because it definitely gets you looking in a different direction. And I think that kind of leads on to the wider question of how do you make sure that everyone's getting value out of research and that it's not just all aimed in one direction.
Yeah, that's definitely like a big, with a lot of like research. I think it's very easy, and I've worked in places that do this, to have a team go off, do a bunch of research, disappear for 3-6 months, come back and go, right, here is our 100-page slide deck that explains the methodology, the process we went through, all of our findings. Like, it's great. It's amazing that so much depth and rigor has gone into the process. But ultimately, no one is going to read that report and no one is going to remember it in probably a week's time. And also, like, the world changes, right? Like, things that are true today are not always true 6 months later, like new technology, like especially like in the technology field, right? Technology is changing constantly. It is changing the way that we kind of like interact with the world. And so you always kind of need to
Great time to cut out there. Like you were saying, how technology is changing and the world is improving, and yet your internet does not work.
How do you make it so research in a way that works? I think for me, a lot of it is just about like getting more people involved. So rather than having like a small contingent who go off and do the research, like get developers. We we would get like the banking product people to kind of join research. So we'd go out, chat to people about how they use like credit cards, savings accounts, loans. And we got people who basically come from traditional finance backgrounds, worked at the likes of HSBC, Santander in the UK, who worked on, credit cards for their entire career. We got them to come out to research sessions. We were like, just sit, take notes, listen, like don't ask questions, and just listen to people talk. And that was like super eye-opening for them. They suddenly were like, holy shit, I did not realize that this how people use credit cards. Like, I remember being in like a taxi back from a session with a guy who'd been working on credit cards for like 15 years or something. And he was just like, I just wanted to like jump in and be like, no, this is how you should be using the credit card to maximize the money out of it. And I was like, I'm so glad you didn't for a start, because that would have been awful. But I'm also like, that was like how we then started to prove that like this is really valuable. This is why we're trying to do something different. This is why like old styles of thinking of like, hey, I've worked on credit cards for 15 years, therefore this is what we need to do, needs to change. So I think the more you can just open people up to that, like the more you can just share actual insights with people, like can really help sort of show that value. And I guess like the other thing as well is like getting people into the kind of like, I guess, the analysis process. So like doing affinity mapping, doing workshops. I remember when we did a big discovery project a couple of years back, we did like a sort of how might we session with each of the teams, where like myself and Nick, the PM who worked on the project, like we sort of talked through like all of our findings, but we were very keen to get everyone thinking about like, okay, what are the key problems? What are the pains? What are the possible solutions? And actually just get people to engage with the research material rather than feeling like it's a thing you have to sit down and read and distill. And that means that you can just then start using that research a lot faster.
Yeah, I've definitely found those sessions much more interesting, because in the past, when you've been handed like a table of like, oh, here's the survey results, and I'm like, cool, I don't really care. Whereas when it's more framed as like, go away, take some time, have a think about like what this means to you. Do you like, are there any cool ideas you can come up with? I think especially as like considering myself more of like a product developer versus like a software engineer, the idea of like hearing people's problems and then being like, oh, what's cool things we could do to fix these issues? And sort of like all like ideas like, oh, I could make a proof of concept for that or this. And I think that makes research so much more interesting. And it doesn't necessarily mean that any of those ideas end up being right or being used. But I also think then like presenting those back to your team and being like, this is what I understood from the research and like this is the angle I took from it. I think it can then be quite interesting for like other roles like designers or PMs or whatever to then be like, oh, okay, because I imagine all of our brains work very differently. And so we all look at this research from a different angle and pull out different things and see things in a very different way. So I think it's important to involve people at like many steps. But I do think like involving people in the analysis is definitely like an underrated part.
I remember like a really good bit of feedback I got from an engineer at a previous company was just them saying, hey, it would be great if whenever you made a design change, just telling us what informed that change. Because like we were doing a lot of usability testing at the time and we were kind of building at the same time that we were like testing, our designs. And so things were constantly like changing and in flux. And that is obviously like very frustrating for developers who maybe have built something and then it's like, hey, let's change this up. And actually just suddenly turning around and going like, look, we tested this like last week. It kind of performed pretty poorly. So we've kind of taken the time to like tweak it a little bit, or we got a bit of feedback that like this was really interesting. So we decided to kind of like dial that up a little bit. Just suddenly made it like, we're still making changes and that was obviously still painful, but it felt like there was more of a rationale and people could kind of understand a bit more. Like I go, oh yeah, actually I can definitely see why we're doing that. And I think again, to your point, it gets other people starting to think about like how insight can turn into like solutions in a very different way to just design hand you something, you build it.
Yeah, which was my old favorite way of doing things. It's like, oh, you want me to build that? Sure. I won't ask questions. And now I think I ask you way too many questions and I think you wish I'd asked less. I'm like, Rob, why are we doing this? This doesn't make sense. And you're like, oh, now I have to explain myself. But no, I do think it gets us to better solutions in the end. It just definitely is, it's quite a change from sort of where I was probably at like 5 years ago. I just used to be like, oh yes. And I'd only like very rarely question something if I'm like, this doesn't seem like the right shade of purple. Whereas now I'm like, do we want that user flow? Does that make sense? Will people do that? And you're like, But
so
it's definitely been.
I was gonna say, let me turn it on you then at this point, because you're saying that obviously you've not been that involved in research, but we do try and get engineers like more involved in things, like you're sitting in on research calls and taking notes. And I'm interested in like how that's been for you as an engineer, like being able to join those things, join workshops and so
on. If we jump to like the user tools bit first, because that's where you start. At first, I really didn't want to do it. I was like, am I going to get any value from this? Like, I was like, oh, I'm just going to kind of sit there and take notes while you or Nick ask questions. I was like, sure. I was like, I can do that. And I think for the first like 1 or 2 sessions, I was a little unconvinced. And I think part of that was like purely down to my like lack of experience of doing it. So I didn't really get like involved. But I think as time's gone on and I've sort of realized that I can actually like listen to the person as they're talking and like ask them questions, I've realized that actually sometimes what I'm hearing and the questions that pop into my head are very different from maybe the way that you or Nick would respond to questions. And therefore, we're getting like multiple angles when we're doing it. And I've actually then ended up finding it very useful. I think some of the ones that recently I found very useful was when we were we've been like considering some new features, and we wanted to like actually chat to people about them before we even bothered to start like building them, which was the first time I think we've done that as a team, and it was really cool, because people were pointing out like flaws basically immediately, and I was able to be like, oh, okay, so what would you actually expect that to do? And like I sort of had all these like solutions running through my head as it was going, versus maybe if if I wasn't on that call, or if we hadn't done it at all, when we would have just built it, and then I would have been like, why does no one understand how this works? It's so obvious. So yeah, like it's definitely turned around from at first me being like, this is pointless. So that's a positive.
Yeah, I think because we've done this for like a bunch of different sort of styles of research, where it's like high level discovery to like usability testing and stuff. And I think those can be very, very different experiences, especially like discovery, where like it's hard to know what the output is going to be, right? Like you're just kind of looking for information, and sometimes it kind of confirms what you already knew, and you're like, okay, yeah, like it seems that the biggest challenge facing, demographic X is still this, and we've just spent a month or so relearning that, which I still think is fair. I think it's good validation to know that you're still on the right track. It should never be discounted if you come out of research and go, we didn't really learn anything new. You probably have actually learned something new. It's just it's more small scale than a big kind of like, oh shit, like this is the thing that people need right now.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think that is often very challenging the first time you join one of those calls, because it just feels like, you're kind of talking to people and you can't really see like how that then becomes a feature or a product or a solution at the other end.
Yeah. And I think one of the other things that I found difficult is in the analysis stages, depending on like how far through we are like analyzing stuff. Like if it's the initial analysis after we've just done like loads of research calls or whatever, and we're still trying to stay like really light and go for the like how might we angles. My brain does not how might we very well. I try, but my brain goes, oh my god, this is a fun thing to build, or sort of like, ooh, that would look cool, I would like that. And it takes like a lot of effort for me to like stop myself going that far and instead go, actually, what are we trying to solve? What's the problem we're trying to solve? And take a step back. And I think it's quite common for engineers to struggle with that part, because I think we are built with the idea of like solutions, like let's build a solution. But I think it's an important skill to learn as an engineer, to actually take a step back and be like, is this solving the thing we think it is? Because I think especially when you build a feature and maybe people aren't using it, I think if you're so solution focused, it can become very like infuriating, because you don't understand it. You're like, this thing is, it's accessible by this button and it works. Why aren't people using it? And unless you take a step back and understand what problem you're trying to solve, you can never truly reflect on why people aren't using something. And so I think by being involved in like user research and the discovery, it's made it so much easier to have those moments of reflection and actually try and work out why someone might not be using a feature, or why they're using it differently than you expected.
Yeah, I think that thing you describe of, finding it difficult to just focus on like uncovering like, okay, like what is the problem here? Like not just jump to solutions. I think that's a challenge for a lot of people, like not just engineers. It's not, I don't think it's how people naturally think, in many ways. Like there's something maybe societal that encourages us to always be thinking of like how to solve a problem, rather than how do I unpack this problem. It like again comes back to, we always hear from
it really sounded like my therapist for a moment there. She was jumping to solutions, let's unpack the problem, and I'm like, no, give me a solution. Sorry, do continue with the therapist analogy of user research.
But yeah, going back to the thing I was saying about when we hear from customers directly via CSMs, where they'll request a feature, again, like they are having a problem. They are like, there is something that is stopping them from doing what they need to. And rather than being like, coming to us with what the problem is, like the problem only comes if it's like a bug, or like I thought I could do X, but I can't. But most of the time, what you'll get is like a solution. I think a common one we've heard in the past is like, I want CSS like customization. And I love using this as an example because it's like that is a solution, but it'd be interesting to understand like what is it that they actually want to do. And often it's more interesting layouts or just like tweaking a bit of spacing. And there are so many other ways that you could solve that problem. But I think people just aren't wired to think in that way. Like they just think like, oh, it'd be great if I had this. I think that would make things easier. And so yeah, a lot of it is like you kind of have to unlearn some of that stuff and you just have to practice it. It's true of a lot of, I think, research stuff, which it being a soft skill, just it's just a kind of muscle you kind of have to constantly like train and get better at. Like even asking questions and stuff, like the way, like, it's very important to try and like avoid asking like sort of binary yes no questions and like ask questions that kind of prompt like more reflection or digging deeper into something, but also like questions that sometimes come across as a bit awkward, like the common usability testing thing of like, someone's working through a flow, they get stuck somewhere and they go, oh, what happens if I do X? And you as the usability tester has to like turn around and say, what do you think happens if you were to do X? Which it's not how you would normally run a conversation or like talk to someone to just throw that question back in their face. But you kind of need to because you actually like getting them to think about what would they expect is going to be very revealing. I always find that
this, Rob, is why I do not sign up to do usability testing because I could not deal with the discomfort of you being like, what do you think is going to happen? I don't want to be wrong. I don't know. I'm not going to press it anymore. I'm just ending the call. Don't need that £25 Amazon voucher. It's fine.
But that stuff is, again, it's like it's really hard. And I remember when I started doing like user research early in my career, like I'd done a bit at like university, but like doing it professionally and like not like particularly on like work I've been doing, and there's like really kind of like, oh, I've made this thing and I made this prototype and I can't wait to test it with people. And then like, early on, like people are just like not understanding, and I just want to like jump in and be like, if you click this button and it tells you like this thing here, and like this is the explanation that we're giving you, and that just like it's so hard to like get out of that habit and not want to try and like immediately like justify everything that you've designed.
It's like raising a child. You want to just tell them to just like put one leg in front of each other to walk, and you're like, you can't do that. That's not how that works.
One place I worked at entertained the idea of like having the like designers write the test scripts and stuff, but then having someone else run the session so the designer couldn't like sort of clarify anything,
just to like hold them back.
Like, yes, like no, like, you're not allowed in.
Just get someone that has no clue what they're doing to run the session. It sounds perfect.
You need very detailed scripts at that point, but yeah. Fortunately, it didn't come to that, but I think it'd have been an interesting experiment to see, like, does it remove even more bias?
Probably would. Although I wonder if it would almost bias it in the other way, because if like someone was struggling, I'd be like, yeah, I don't know either. Doesn't make sense. Terrible design. Just take it down a completely different path. So maybe not. But yeah, I mean, this all sounds way too difficult to be doing. So it leads me to the spicy question of, should teams hire a dedicated researcher?
Yes. Next question.
Lovely. Moving on.
To expand on that, I'm a big advocate for like teams should have like dedicated research resource, because I think whilst I do think a lot of UXers and product designers, have done research in their careers and they're very passionate about research and they enjoy doing it. It is like one string in like a bow of like many that we have to deal with. And it's something that, again, if people aren't practicing it a lot, it can fall by the wayside. Like it just is very tricky to both be doing the day-to-day design work and also to be Sorry, that's my door. I think I've got a delivery. 1 second.
Oh, Rob's got a delivery. Researchers, great. No, genuinely, I do actually appreciate having people that know what they're doing. We had a researcher, I'm using my favorite phrase of at zero height, a while back, and they actually taught me loads about what research was and how to do it and how to actually be involved. And so I do agree with Rob's general point of having a researcher in the team is quite helpful. You can now keep going, Rob. I filled the gap with some rambling. You're welcome.
Amazing. I was going to say, like, the editor can just cut around that gap, probably. Yeah, so I did. UX designers, product designers, research is something we do, but I would probably say for most people, it's not the primary thing we do, right? Like, we are also having to make designs, do QA with engineers, like all manner of stuff. And having someone who has expertise in research, who is kind of keeping up to date on like where things need to be at, like especially kind of considering how things have changed over the past few years with the likes of GDPR and like other data policies in kind of like California, like that stuff is just things that like it helps to have someone who really knows that stuff, can make sure the entire team is on it, and also more importantly, just be a really strong advocate for research across the organization. Like it really helps, particularly to have someone who is like, this person owns our research practice, and making sure that not just the designers are kind of working within the sort of best ways of working, but product people are as well, and marketing people if they want to get involved in doing kind of like user stuff, and also at the kind of like C level, like that they understand like what we're trying to do, and also being that point person to take on the bigger discovery projects, the things that are like trying to uncover like what should our strategy for the next year, 2 years, or what should our product vision be like. I think there's a lot of stuff that a really great dedicated research person or team should be owning personally, but often isn't the case at a lot of companies. So yeah, I always say yes, even though I think realistically, like I never want to stop doing research. It's just I'm also aware I don't have the time to always do it.
Not with the amount of things we throw at you on a daily basis.
Very true.
But yeah, no, I think I do think that just because you have a dedicated researcher also doesn't mean that the rest of the team shouldn't be involved. I think they're great for organizing certain things and teaching best practices and helping to run things. But yeah, I think the team being involved is still super important. And I think sometimes learning that the hard way by not having a researcher is the way to do that. And then you can see the value that you've lost, but you've also gained some insight into how to do it yourself. Yeah, did you have any more thoughts on research? Anything around like things to watch out for or anything else?
Yeah, I think like whilst I've kind of mainly just been talking about how great research is and why you should do it, like there are definitely pitfalls, right? Like research is not like a silver bullet, and is not like it's not going to solve all your problems. You can still end up building the wrong thing. I would say you're going to be more informed about the things you're building, so you are potentially going to be on the right track. But if you're not asking the right questions, if you're not like speaking to the right people, it can still kind of lead you astray. I think even like in usability testing, that you have to always consider the human element of the people you're speaking to, right? Usability testing, I think, is a great example because there's a natural like tendency for people to try and like give you the answer they think you want to hear, because no one wants to necessarily turn around and say, hey, this design looks like shit.
I will.
And the same thing that we were talking about at the top, which is also people don't want to always admit when they don't know something. That's where you get people asking like, what happens if I click this button? Because they don't want to say they don't know. Like they kind of turn it into a question, or just like you often hear people being like, yeah, this makes sense, I get this, and it's like, but do you though? And so often like making sure you're asking clarifying questions that kind of get to that is quite important. But even then, there'll still be cases where things don't work. I think I had one really big example of this in my career, which is like we flirted with the idea of like building a chatbot for a project I was on. We were working on this kind of complex thing that we knew that like it was basically around energy switching. We knew a lot of people don't switch energy suppliers. Like we had like a lot of data to back that up. We tried a few things that hadn't really taken off. So we looked at the idea of like, well, what if we had like a chatbot that could help dispel the myths around energy switching, help people guide themselves through like an FAQ style onboarding that would kind of give them a bit more insight. So we built something really basic, me and a product technologist. We sort of had like a working like chatbot prototype. We wrote scripts in Twine to kind of like, yeah, to kind of have like branching paths and all this sort of stuff. It was really quick to build. We tested it and it tested really well. It was a roaring success. Like people were like not necessarily reading everything, but they were like clicking through the bits that meant the most to them and like kind of going, oh, I didn't know that. That's really interesting. And like all that kind of stuff. Like, everything was like really positive. So we went and built it and it resulted in like no conversion. It was a complete failure. Yeah, and that's just like, you know, that's just the nature of things. Like sometimes like you can do the research and it's not going to pay off, and sometimes it will unlock something. But you know, you're always having to deal with humans, and you know, being aware that like testing something with a user is always like an artificial scenario. Like you're catching them at the best time, right? They have people from the company on a phone call with them. They are completely undistracted. You know, they're not, you know, thinking about the fact they've got like, you know, a Monday meeting in like 10 minutes, or, you know, they maybe, you know, don't have like other people in the office around them, like bugging them because they're in a meeting room on a call with you. So like it completely changes like the way people interact with the product. I think that is always kind of an important thing to keep in mind when you're doing testing and even research. You know, people always want to try and present the very best version of themselves. So you have to still do a little bit of reading between the lines and interpretation.
Yeah, I think it's also quite common for people to make assumptions as well, is what I found with sort of the later on research when you're potentially like proposing solutions of how things might work or what could be a solution. I feel like people play around with it and be like, oh yeah, this is great. And in the back of their mind, they're actually assuming it will do an extra like 3 things that unless you specifically dig into and ask about, they just won't mention, because they're like, oh yeah, of course, if you add that there, it will do this, this, and this, because that's what they need and what they want. Rather than actually, if you then sort of ask them like, oh, so what are you know, your terribly cheesy question of what are you expecting it to do? And then suddenly you realize that they're making assumptions that it will do 10 other things that you haven't even thought about yet. So,
yeah, that thing with like the level of fidelity you're dealing with in sort of like testing prototypes can often be really tricky. Like, are you using data they're familiar with? Like, this is a struggle we had on the finance product because we couldn't use, well, one didn't have a product to start with, so we had no data that we could use from customers. But also, you probably wouldn't want to do that. You wouldn't, you know, there's a lot of like risk if you're trying to deal with people's banking data. So it made it very tricky to kind of like test things in a way that people would understand. You know, when they're looking at a transaction list or just a breakdown of bills, like how do you get across like something that if they saw their own data, they would probably get it. But because you're mocking something up, it needs to be understandable. And often that was a case of like picking the most obvious things of like, okay, like let's just put in Starbucks. Most people know what Starbucks is. They'll get that like that's a coffee. And it's just like you have to start to think about like how do you kind of remove some of those barriers. The tricky one was always rent. How do you get across like what the rent payment is?
I think one of the trickiest scenarios I've been in is when I was working on like an app that was meant to be used by 2 to 6-year-olds. And trying to do user research with the 2 to 6-year-old is interesting. And also most of them, like the majority of our users were over in like China. So you sort of had a language barrier. You also had like an age barrier, and so you sort of end up on this Zoom call trying to watch like a 4-year-old use an app and then trying to glean information from that. And yeah, that was a struggle.
Yeah.
And I don't know who in the world has perfected user research for that sort of age group, but yeah, I'd be impressed if they have managed to, because that was an interesting scenario to be in. It's definitely much easier now that our user research is on sort of like, largely talking to like designers that do research themselves. So when you're asking them questions, doing user research with them, they understand what you're doing, and therefore it's much easier to have a conversation where they kind of know what you're looking for and are much more likely to sort of answer the questions in an open manner and explain their assumptions and do all those sorts of things. So I feel like at the moment it's slightly easier to do user research than it has been at like previous jobs for me.
Although, does that mean they can game the conversation a little bit easier? They know exactly what you want to hear. They know how to present it in a way that will influence your decision making.
Absolutely. Have you ever seen our community Slack channel where I'm like, I know you're a designer, and so they're like, actually, if you just did this, I'm like, oh, it's so annoying because you phrase that in such a perfect way that I can't really argue it. It's just gaming the system, and I respect it.
We love all of our users here at Zero Height.
We do. I very much appreciate all the feedback. I'm the person that goes through replies to it all, so if you're ever on Slack, it'll be me you're chatting to. Now Rob replies sometimes too. Yeah, nice. I think we can probably wrap it up there. We've covered a lot about user research. So yeah, thanks everyone for listening, and we will see you next time.